There are two distinct ways to build wealth in the modern U.S. economy, and they operate under entirely different sets of rules. The first track is ordinary income, like a W-2 salary. Every dollar earned here must pass through a mandatory tax filter before it reaches your bank account. The second track is asset appreciation. When stocks or real estate go up in value, that growth occurs completely untaxed as long as you hold the asset. This dual-track system enables a strategy known as buy, borrow, die. Instead of selling appreciated assets, which triggers a capital gains tax, investors take out massive secured loans using those assets as collateral. The debt acts as a bypass pipeline, allowing them to extract cash for consumption without ever triggering a taxable event. The strategy concludes at the end of the investor's life. Section 1014 of the tax code resets the taxable value of an asset to its current market price when the owner dies. This stepped-up basis permanently erases the deferred capital gains liability, letting appreciation escape income tax entirely. This chart shows the effective tax rates for different financial strategies. Macroeconomic modeling demonstrates an explicit 11.7% mathematical advantage when an investor chooses to borrow against their assets rather than sell them. This structural advantage violates horizontal equity, the basic economic principle that taxpayers with similar total incomes should face similar tax burdens. It also heavily distorts capital allocation, encouraging investors to hoard assets to avoid taxes, driving extreme wealth concentration at the very top. To fix this, lawmakers routinely propose three systemic reforms: implementing an annual wealth tax, a mark-to-market income tax, or simply repealing stepped-up basis. But these consensus solutions face a severe practical paradox. When exposed to the realities of constitutional law and political pressure, they consistently prove unworkable. To actually reach the world's largest portfolios, policymakers must stop targeting the static asset itself. Instead, the solution legally redefines the initiation of a secured loan as a taxable realization event. The current policy debate fixates on taxing stationary wealth. That ignores the true vulnerability in the system. The moment a taxpayer extracts millions in untaxed liquidity to fund their lifestyle. To test how a tax on borrowing would work, we have to look at how current law shapes a single transaction. Imagine an investor holding highly appreciated stock who needs $1 million in cash to consume. This split-screen balance sheet details their choices. On the left is the standard asset sale. To net $1 million in cash, the investor sells $1.25 million of stock to cover a 20% tax. Paying that tax shrinks their total net worth immediately. On the right side is the borrowing scenario. By taking a $1 million secured loan instead of selling, the investor gets the exact same cash, but their core net worth remains completely intact. Fast forward to inheritance. The stepped-up basis clears the deferred tax liability on the borrowed side. The final metric is stark. The heir in the borrowing scenario nets exactly 25% more wealth, simply because the original investor chose debt. This anomaly exists because of how courts interpret the statutory definition of the word disposition. In cases like Woodsum Associates, the courts ruled that pledging an asset as collateral for a loan does not count as disposing of it. Because it technically isn't a disposition, it isn't taxed. We see this exact collateralized debt structure utilized by the world's most recognizable founders. In 2022, SEC filings detailed Elon Musk's proposal to take out a $12.5 billion loan secured directly by his appreciated Tesla stock. The U.S. tax code's rigid definition of disposition accidentally created a legal proxy for selling an asset, one that operates entirely tax-free. So why not just pass a straightforward wealth tax to capture this value? It fails the first constitutional stress test, the Article I apportionment constraint. This rule dictates that any direct tax on property must be distributed among the states strictly based on their populations. This map compares the structural reality of Texas and Virginia to show why apportionment breaks a wealth tax. Based on the census, Texas has 3.3 times the population of Virginia. However, Virginia actually holds 3% more cumulative wealth. Because an apportioned tax relies on head counts rather than dollars,
Poorer, high-population states would be forced to pay mathematically destructive tax rates just to meet their constitutional quotas. The second stress test blocks a mark-to-market tax. The 16th Amendment explicitly limits Congress's unapportioned taxing power to incomes. Originalist legal arguments, recently appearing in Supreme Court dissents, argue that unsold, unrealized gains simply do not meet the constitutional definition of income. If it is an income, it can't be taxed without hitting the apportionment trap. The final stress test prevents lawmakers from repealing stepped-up basis. It falls victim to political optionality. This is the strategic benefit taxpayers gain by deferring their taxes, betting that future legislation will eventually swing back in their favor. If the government only taxes assets at death, living taxpayers are incentivized to hoard their portfolios and lobby future legislatures to reinstate the loophole. This is not theoretical. Taxpayers successfully lobbied to reverse stepped-up basis repeals in 1980 and 2010. The first best solutions are structurally flawed. They either trigger the immediate immune response of the U.S. constitutional system, or they invite inevitable political reversal. This forces policymakers to look at a highly viable second-best solution, deemed realization. This policy fully integrates borrowing into the existing income tax framework by treating a loan against an appreciated asset as a taxable realization event. To protect the middle class, the policy establishes strict parameters. It explicitly excludes primary mortgages, ordinary student loans, and credit cards. It also implements a $250,000 annual individual exemption. We can trace the exact mechanics using example A from the macroeconomic models. Imagine an investor initiates a $10.5 million loan secured against $10 million in stock. This conceptual stack illustrates the asset's underlying values. The stock consists of a $1 million cost basis, the original purchase price, and a $9 million unrealized gain. Subtracting a $500,000 joint exemption leaves exactly $10 million in covered, taxable borrowing. Here is where the policy collides with the asset. Even though the covered loan is $10 million, the liability is strictly capped by the size of the $9 million unrealized gain. The transaction triggers a 23.8% tax exclusively on that $9 million. To ensure the IRS does not tax this exact same growth a second time when the asset is eventually sold, the policy uses an offset mechanism. The cost basis physically steps up to match the taxed amount. The ledger remains perfectly balanced. By strictly bounding the tax to the unrealized gain and simultaneously adjusting the basis, the policy safely captures extreme wealth consumption without legally classifying as a direct tax on property. We know exactly how this targeted reform performs at scale by analyzing the latest microsimulation revenue data based on the Survey of Consumer Finances. Deemed realization projects $102 billion generated within the standard 10-year budget window. But this absolute revenue is less important than the policy's extreme precision. Distributional data shows it leaves the bottom 90% untouched, concentrating the financial burden hyper-specifically on the 99.9th percentile. This solves the core tension of horizontal equity, neutralizing the massive mathematical advantage of utilizing debt over income. Returning to this chart of effective tax rates, deemed realization dynamically closes the loophole. The 11.7% gap drops, bringing the structural advantage of borrowing down to exactly zero. The bypass pipeline is sealed. Fixing the U.S. tax code does not require rewriting the Constitution or upending property law. Policymakers merely need to tax the extraction of liquidity, neutralizing the architecture of buy, borrow, die once and for all.